Hello everyone, good to see you all, hope you're well. Now today I'm going to talk about a worldview which we tend to call cosmopolitan liberalism. And it's one that feels increasingly dominant in universities and cultural institutions and particularly the media. It's a worldview that sees itself as left-wing, socially conscious, progressive and self-evidently modern. But the thing is, like all worldviews, it has a history. And once you understand that history, you start to notice the contradictions that many people never see. Now, I work in the liberal world. I work in an academic university world, and I spend my days around people who inhabit this worldview. And I've seen this contradiction. You know, I've sat in their £1 million apartments as they wear their £300 pound jeans. But at the same time, they have a picture of Che Guevara on their wall, hanging over, a designer furniture, designer sofa or something. And I've listened to them speak earnestly about equality and poverty and injustice and sustainable living and so on, and ethical consumption, all of that. Without seeing that contradiction, with the quiet confidence, that those who believe, that we're on the right side of history. And then, of course, 10 minutes away, in the housing schemes, people are worrying about their rent and they're living in squalor. They're worrying about addiction services and food banks and housing scarcity and all these things, and, whether the bus will actually show up. And I just think this contradiction is just extraordinary. Again, and once you've lived in both worlds, the unreality of these kind of experiences become impossible to ignore. I mean, part of the reason I notice this is my own background. I grew up in a very, very poor council estate. I was the child of immigrant parents and so on. And in a world, where everyone was unemployed, everyone was struggling for money. Nobody had the kind of luxury to talk about these kind of things. People are dealing with this daily grind of sort of keeping their heads above water. And the thing is, it's an advantage, I find, because when you live in both worlds, you start to see the join, you see the seams between class cultures that never really quite meet. Because this worldview, this bubble that these people live in, it didn't appear out of nowhere. It has a lineage. And once you trace that lineage, the modern version becomes much, much easier to understand. Now, to understand liberalism today, you have to understand liberalism itself, not the modern slogan version of liberalism, but the historical tradition. And you have to understand that in the modern world, liberalism often gets mistaken for socialism. You hear this all over the place, all press, everyone says this, they're kind of socialists, communists, liberals, they're all kind of the same thing. It's not true at all. They are fundamentally different. Liberalism is a rights-based ideology, while socialism is a power-based ideology. So liberalism asks whether individuals are free to express themselves, speak their minds, worship as they choose, and live without arbitrary interference. Socialism, on the other hand, asks who owns what, who controls what, and who benefits from the structure of society that exists today. So liberalism is about personal liberty, and socialism is about economic justice. And that's where we have this disconnect. Because this distinction really, really matters, because liberalism has always been comfortable with rights, but very uncomfortable with redistribution. It's always been willing to grant symbolic recognition, but reluctant to alter the material foundations of society. And that pattern goes back a long, long way. So Victorian 19th century liberalism was built on the idea that society could be improved from above. So reformers, they campaigned for literacy and sanitation and temperance and moral uplift. But they never questioned the class structure itself. They wanted the poor basically to behave better, not live better. And what happens is liberalism learns very early that rights cost nothing, while redistribution costs something, costs a lot, and it chooses rights. In the early 20th century, liberalism evolved into this managerial worldview, where you get educated professionals believing that they could run society through expertise and rational planning. They genuinely thought they were speaking for everyone, but they're really speaking for themselves. They're speaking for their class, for people who shared their assumptions and their worldview. And you get this carries on after the Second World War. Managerialism kind of hardens into technocracy, where policy experts believed that they could engineer progress through planning and evidence and so on. But when it comes to land and housing and capital and ownership, the structural foundations of inequality, the conversation stops. Liberalism again chooses rights over redistribution. And by the time the professionalised New Left arrived, liberalism had become the ideology of the professional class. Meritocracy was treated as some kind of moral principle. Educational credentials became the new currency capital. And yet, for all the talk of modernisation and social mobility, the material foundations of inequality remained untouched. Modern cosmopolitan liberalism is simply the latest version of that lineage. It expresses itself through ethical consumption, curated radicalism, green privilege, and a lifestyle politics that feel progressive but rarely touch the structure of society. It's the descendant of this Victorian paternalism and all these other things. It's a class ideology that has always preferred symbolism to structure, rights in favour of redistribution, and lifestyle to actual material change. And this is why liberalism is so often today mistaken for socialism, because it speaks the language of progress, but it avoids the substance of economic justice. Now, there's another part of this story, and it comes straight out of 19th century politics. In the Victorian era, when the poor were largely disenfranchised, politics was essentially a battle between two elites. So in Britain, for example, we all know Gladstone and Disraeli. They disagreed passionately on both sides, conservative and liberal. But they inhabited essentially the same social world. They lived similar lives, they earned similar incomes, they shared similar assumptions about how society should be organised. The working class existed, but it existed outside of the political arena. And the concern today, I think, is that we're drifting back toward that world. Over the last few decades, formerly socialist parties across the Western world have become parties of the professional class. They still speak the language of progress, but they no longer speak the language of economic justice. They've embraced rights, representation, lifestyle politics, cultural progressivism, but they've largely abandoned redistribution, issues of ownership and class power. And once that shift happens, the political battlefield now narrows dramatically. Instead of a contest between different classes, you get a contest between different elites. And you can see it. I mean, I mentioned going to these houses earlier on and so on. So you find the Che Guevara poster hanging above the sort of very expensive designer sofa in one. In the conservative household, you'll find a Spitfire or something, or a portrait of Churchill maybe, hanging over another very elegant, French 19th century Baroque sofa or something. So different symbols, different aesthetics, but the same postcode. The same income bracket, the same cultural confidence. These people, they often go to the same universities. They live in the same neighbourhoods. They shop in the same places, the same kind of elite shops. They disagree fiercely, but only with the same set of rules and within the boundaries of this worldview that they both inhabit. And one of the clearest signs of this is what we often call equality politics. And this is the belief that the great moral task of society is to ensure that everyone can compete fairly. That's essentially what it's for. That's the big campaign. It's a nice idea, and again, we should absolutely applaud these kind of ideas. at base, this is a worldview obsessed with the idea of opportunity, with access, with representation, with making sure that the race is open to all. But the thing is, it never questions the race itself. It never asks, who built the racetrack? If you want to take that analogy further, who owns the stadium? Who profits from the spectacle? So the thing about equality politics is it aims to create, rats that can race. It never asks why we live in a rat race at all. And nowhere is this clearer than in modern green politics. The thing about green politics, of course, there is a premium price attached to almost every green product. Ethical coffee, sustainable clothing, organic food, eco-friendly washing detergent, and so on. These things cost more. And the simple fact is the poor can't afford them. So what you get is a strange moral hierarchy. So people who shop at Primark and Lidl, because that's their skin, that's all they can basically afford, they're quietly judged by people who can afford to moralize through their financial power. You see, green politics, of course, is built on this idea of saving the world. But let me be very frank. For many working class people, the honest response to that kind of statement is, what has the world ever done for me? Again, this is not because they're backward and not because they're stupid. It's because the world they inhabit never offered them stability or opportunity or security or dignity. The world has been something to survive, to endure, not something to save. And this moral distance is amplified by capitalism itself, because we are drenched in lifestyle advertising. Buy this, buy that, upgrade your life, improve your image, achieve prestige through consumption, buy enlightenment. Everything's got a price there, everything is monetized. And I say in the liberal households of my friends and so on, the crusade pans, for example, they aren't just cookware. They're symbols. They're symbols of taste and virtue and achievement. In the same way that a well-stocked wine cellar is a symbol of conservative prestige. The message is always the same. You are what you buy. And people have stopped, becoming citizens. They've now become consumers. That's the worrying shift we have in this late capitalist society. And of course, when politics is conducted between elites who live rather comfortably inside this consumerist worldview, elites who moralize through purchases, who express identity through decor, the working class notices this. And they notice that nobody is speaking for them. They notice that nobody is talking about their lives. You've only got to switch on the news to realize that. They notice nobody is addressing the structural issues that shape their world. And this is where the rise of populism comes from today. It's not an eruption of irrational anger. It's not a sudden collapse of civility in society. It's not really a mystery. It's the political expression of people who've been left behind by a system that no longer sees them. So when both major parties converge on elite assumptions, when both become essentially rights-based rather than redistribution-based, the working class is left without a political home. And of course, when the people lose their political home, they go looking for one. And sometimes they find it, as we've seen, in movements that are chaotic, contradictory, or dangerous. Sometimes they find it in figures who promise to break the system rather than reform it. And I don't need to tell you about so many populist leaders who emerge with that promise. But the underlying cause is always the same. A political class that has stopped speaking to them. And this is the danger of a politics conducted entirely within the bubble. It becomes a conversation between people who live similar lives, earn similar incomes, and share similar assumptions, and who genuinely believe that they are speaking for everyone because they are speaking confidently. But confidence isn't universality, and elite politics isn't democracy. Now, here's something I always tell my students. If you want to understand history properly, follow the money. Not the discourse, not the rights, not the slogans, not the landmark pieces of legislation, the money. And historically, liberalism has always stopped at the money. Take the American South, for example, after emancipation, where former slaves are given rights, constitutional amendments, legal protections, moral recognition, etc., etc. But when it comes to the money, when it comes to land, capital, the promised 40 acres and a mule and so on, nothing arrives. And that's because rights cost nothing. Land costs something. Liberalism stops at the money. And the same pattern, I say, in Victorian Britain you have. You have reformers who improve sanitation and literacy and moral behaviour and all of that, but they never touch the class structure. Because, again, rights cost nothing. Redistribution costs something. And today's cosmopolitan liberalism follows the same pattern. It talks endlessly about sustainability and ethical consumption and micro-mobility and organic food in school meals and all this kind of stuff. But it rarely touches class, ownership, deprivation, housing, addiction. It is brilliant at symbolic politics and hopeless at material politics. It prefers the things that cost nothing. Again, rights cost nothing. Lifestyle politics, cost nothing. Performative solidarity costs nothing. Putting a Che Guevara poster on your wall, that doesn't cost anything. Talking about electric car charging points and how we need more of them because it will help the environment, that costs nothing. But redistribution costs something. Again, liberalism always stops at the money. And the thing is, this is where I always end up. Back in that moment, of stunned silence sitting in these conversations amongst my colleagues, once you've lived in these different worlds, once you've crossed the class borders and you see the joy, I say, you realize something very simple and very uncomfortable. Most of the people inside this cosmopolitan liberal bubble are perfectly nice. They're perfectly well-intentioned, perfectly progressive in their own way. They say all the right things, they perform all the right gestures and so on. They recycle properly, they buy the ethical products, they attend the sustainability workshops and so on, talk very earnestly about green futures and all of that. But they just don't get it. Not because I say they're bad people or they're hypocrites. It's because they've never lived outside their own world. They've never had to choose between heating and food. They've never sat in a GP waiting room for 4 or 5 hours. They've never walked home from a night shift because the buses have stopped running. They've never had a parent who couldn't read the school forms to sign for your school trip or whatever. They've never lived in a place where addiction isn't an issue, a social issue. It's just the wallpaper. It's all around you. And when you've lived in that world, then you find yourself, in a £1 million apartment, as I have done, listening to someone explain the moral urgency of e-scooters or something. You realise the problem isn't ideology, it's insulation. Cosmopolitan liberalism, you see, isn't universal. It's not the voice of the working class, and it's not the future of everyone. It's a class culture, polite, progressive, aesthetically radical, materially comfortable, that genuinely believes it speaks for the whole country because it speaks confidently. But again, confidence is not universality and lifestyle isn't politics. Until this bubble learns to read the room, until it understands that organic food and so on in schools, sustainable living seminars mean nothing in places where people are relying on food banks, it will remain what it's always been. And that's an aristocracy in waiting. Another one of the elites ready to replace the current incumbent. Again, not cruel, not malicious, just blind. Blind to the world outside of its own. Blind to the realities that don't fit that lifestyle. And blind to the people who don't speak that language. And I say, once you've moved between these two worlds, as I have, and once you've seen that join, you can't unsee it. You can only really describe it. And of course, that's what I've tried to do today. So take care of yourselves. Thanks for watching. And I'll see you all, my friends, next time. Bye-bye.